Well, I think we are faced with three crises at the moment we can see in this century. The first one, and I would say the one that is closest to us, the one that could happen very soon, very quickly, is the war crisis, a crisis of the possibility of major nuclear war or major confrontation between major powers such as America and China or America and Russia. That could happen anytime, even within the next 5 years. And like the first two world wars, it could happen very quickly. Secondly, the second crisis is a crisis of artificial intelligence and basically a technology crisis. Artificial intelligence and what is often called the singularity, that is the attempt to essentially replace biological humanity by some other physical vehicle for our consciousness. And those people who support that agenda, they are often called the transhumanists, and their doctrine is known as transhumanism. They are looking towards approximately the middle of this century. So they feel that by the middle of this century, biological humanity will have become irrelevant, and that we can be merged into one mind, so to speak, one consciousness. And we can transfer, as I said, our consciousnesses to some other vehicle than the biological. So that's approximately in the middle of the century. And then the crisis, which I think is further, we have more time to engage with, so to speak, is the ecological crisis, which I would divide into two. One is real and one is unreal. The real one is the crisis of pollution and waste, which is a real crisis, and that could become extremely serious by the end of this century. And the one which is unreal is the one which is being hyped and pushed very much at the moment, namely the climate change agenda. But that's further on in, of course, the climate change agenda, people feel that is imminent, that's immediate, even in the 2020s. But as far as I see it, the real ecological crisis, we as humanity, we have more time to deal with. If we look at the ecological crisis in the two ways I've described, this crisis is basically created by our overproduction, which is an essential part of our present mode of capitalist economy. And that is, again, the result of our materialistic way of thinking. A materialistic way of thinking which has developed over the last 400 years or so, which has led to the fact that we no longer have a truly spiritual and feeling relationship both to other human beings and also to the world at large, to nature. So we are in an alienated condition, which means that we are only focused on our own needs and our own wants, and this leads us to try to maximize our desires, to satisfy our greed or our wants and desires, our comfort, our convenience, and of course our profits. And this leads directly to the overproduction, which is such a part of the present mode of capitalist economy. So that's the real ecological problem and the causes behind it, which are ultimately spiritual causes. The other one, the climate change agenda, what is behind that, slightly more complicated to explain. I would say that what we see there, let's take phenomena like Greta Thunberg, this young Swedish campaign activist, and also the Extinction Rebellion movement, which has developed particularly in Britain and is also strong in Germany and Sweden and in America and increasingly around the world. What that is essentially a front for an enormous effort to transform, this is an effort on the part of global and financial elites today, to transform the entire basis of the energy basis of our capitalist economy, from one based on fossil fuels, so that means it's going back 200 years or so since the Industrial Revolution, to a so-called sustainable or renewable energy basis based on solar power, wind power, other forms of alternative energy, the so-called green energy, with a view to making enormous amounts of money and profits out of this new growing green industry, a green industrial revolution, sometimes called the Fourth Industrial Revolution, for financial institutions. And through the use of new financial instruments which have been developed by these financial institutions, so they can direct money from the public, for example, from pension funds and the like, public employees' pension funds and so on, into these financing these green financial instruments. And there we're talking about the prospect of billions of dollars, which can be made through these means. But the important thing to note is that people like Al Gore, who stand in America, who stand very much behind this project, have no intention whatsoever of changing the fundamental basis of our capitalist economy, either in its methods or its ideology. So they intend to maintain the form of social hierarchy and dominance that we have at the moment, but they simply wish to transfer the fossil fuel into renewable energy. Now, the other important point to see is that Al Gore and his friends wish to do all of this as soon as possible. And if you want to do this as soon as possible, you have to mobilize and push societies and states, governments, into carrying this out as soon as possible. And that's where Greta Thunberg and the Extinction Rebellion movement come in, because you need mass public support to do this in order to put pressure on politicians and the governments. And a very good way, or good in inverted commas, a very effective way of doing this is to appeal to people's emotions, appeal to people's sensations, and appeal to people's fears and anxieties that unless this is done as soon as possible, we actually face the end of civilization as we know it, and possibly the end of life on this planet. And that's why, in particular, the appeal is made to young people, an emotional appeal to young people, which is why, as I said, Greta and Extinction Rebellion are the front, the PR front, behind this enormous, large-scale transformation of the economic basis of our society, which is truly historical, what is being attempted. And some people have described this as one of the greatest, if not the greatest, behavioral changes which is being attempted on a mass scale in history. So Al Gore and friends are seeking to convince everybody that we face a World War II style wartime emergency, and therefore we need absolutely radical measures by the government to impose these changes on society within the next decade. So how does the problem of 5G technology and the singularity transhumanism ideology fit into where we are in the 21st century? I think historically one has to see that we really crossed, as humanity in general, we really crossed a major threshold in round about 1800, when the Industrial Revolution got going on the one hand, so you had the new power of steam coming in, but already the very first experiments and developments were being made in electricity. So through the 19th century, as those developed, we can see that humanity gets onto a kind of roller coaster, if you will, which basically is electric power. So once we get on this roller coaster, well, we've been on it since the early experiments of Galvani and Volta, and we're still on it. And this roller coaster is what has been driving our culture in an ever more accelerated fashion since that time. And of course that has led eventually to the internet and to computer technology, which has only increased the rate of acceleration even further. So we are basically hanging on by the skin of our teeth, in essence. And I think what is behind this is a very profound spiritual attack upon humanity to accelerate the processes of development faster than humanity can actually cope with them. Now, our technologists and our scientists, in their, as I see it, unwarranted arrogance, because let's face it, these natural science has only been with us for 400 years. They feel that they are in control of these processes. They feel that, for example, they understand what technology is. What electricity. They feel that they understand what electricity is, what electric power is. They can describe it in natural scientific terms. But I feel that they don't actually really yet understand what electricity is in itself. And it is an almost magical power which has taken over our civilization and has become a kind of a drug which gives us all kinds of wonderful things, so we think. Now, the latest is, as I said, the internet and computers, which is the latest development whereby we are seeking to replicate in an outer form the very processes of our thinking and our brains, just as in 200 years ago, the Industrial Revolution started by replicating our muscles and our cruder physical bodily capacities. So now we have come to the replication of the attempt to replicate our brains and our thinking processes and our minds through computing and the internet. 5G is just the latest development. So many people think that 5G is simply another step up from 3G, 4G, and so on. But actually, we are going to see that it is not just one more step. It is not exactly a quantum leap, but it is a huge step which we are now about to take. And electrosensitive people are already suffering. Well, they've been suffering already even before 5G. But they're already sensing that this is going to create serious problems both for them and for the rest of society. And I think maybe within 10 or 20 years, the kind of medical problems which will start appearing from 5G will start to create really serious difficulties for people. There are many people already who, when they hold a mobile phone to their brain of a 3G or 4G type, already feel how it affects them or how it causes them physical problems. And with 5G, this is going to be much worse in terms of brain cancers and the rest. And then, of course, the 5G network, which will make possible the Internet of Things, so that all products will be able, in theory, to transmit and communicate with each other. This will require a vast increase in the size of the entire infrastructure of our computer technology and of our communications networks. It will require a vast array, for example, of masts, which will need to be created all around cities for these various machines to communicate with each other. And I think that ultimately, as I've already mentioned with regard to transhumanism and the singularity, the attempt is being made to abolish the human physical body. And that, again, is part of what you could call the third abolition of the human being, in the sense that the Church, the Catholic Church, made the first attempt back in the 9th century, began the process by declaring, by passing a dogma against a part of the human soul which was actually related to the human spirit. So they were interested in removing the individual spirit so that human beings would become dependent on the priests. So you cannot think for yourself about the divine or about the spirit. You have to rely on the priest to think for you. There is no individual spirit. So there is only, the human being is only a body and a soul. And then about 1,000 years later, we see that gradually through developments in scientific psychology, in mathematics, and in Marxist philosophy, the soul, the concept of the soul, is undermined. So the human soul is done away with, so to speak. And in the late 19th century, in the 19th century, the 20th century, and now in the 21st century, the attempt is being made to actually remove the human body, the physical body as we know it, and to provide us with some other kind of body, which will only be the result of materialistic natural scientific thinking over 400 years, that has developed over 400 years, in contrast to the human organism, the physical organism, which is the work of profound natural and spiritual forces going back many, many, many millennia, eons. So there's eons of wisdom contained within the construction and nature of our human bodies, compared to a mere 400 years of natural scientific, largely intellectual and abstract development on the part of natural science, which they will use, which they are using for their technology, and which they will use to develop this alternative vehicle, which we are supposed to join our consciousnesses to. The effort by the church, which I mentioned, first of all, to remove the human spirit, that was a profound attack, if you will, upon human freedom. So we see the beginnings of a really strong attempt to remove human freedom there and make human beings dependent on a small, very small group of other human beings back then in the 9th century. But what we are facing now with the technological developments is an assault on human freedom of a far greater nature. The social structure or the social system of control we see in a society like modern China today has actually a lot in common with the Vatican in the 9th century or throughout history, in fact, in the Catholic Church, or also the priesthood in Tibet. So you have a small group of people, relatively small group of people, who through their religious or political ideology are attempting to control and restrict the freedom and guide, restrict the freedom of the mass of the population and guide them essentially like shepherds guiding sheep. Of course, they see themselves as in a benign role in doing that. But essentially, I would say it's the same thing. So individual freedom is not allowed to the mass of the people. And that's why we see in China this attempt through digital technology and the social credit system that they have developed there. All of this technology, of course, has come largely from the West. They are carrying this out to keep this enormous population under control. And I think we shall see increasingly, as the 21st century goes on, that in the West too, similar systems, perhaps not quite so grossly evident as in China, but similar systems of technologically and digitally mediated control will be developed. And in fact, are already being developed in various ways in the West. I think it's important that you know, one sees this attack on freedom in relation to the spirit, the soul, and the body. You see, this is only the latest, the latest aspect, yeah. And because it's the body, that therefore technology is evolved, because obviously technology is part of the physical body and the physical body of the world, yeah. Technology obviously is something which goes on developing over the decades. So you could say it's a process of gradual development. Obviously, at certain points it makes certain jumps, but it is something that everybody knows has been developing gradually since the Industrial Revolution. Compared to that, events such as wars, terrorism incidents, or a campaign like Extinction Rebellion, which suddenly comes in with this impetus that we have to do something now, and very dramatically, this catches people's attention and distracts them very easily away from something which is just gradually developing in the background, so to speak. So the media does tell us about certain developments, so we're all familiar with, for example, with what somebody like Elon Musk says and does. The media reports on that, but they don't present it in any way that this is really seen as an existential challenge to humanity, I would say. It's largely seen in terms of convenience and what it will bring us in terms of comfort, convenience, and ease of life. Yeah? Only occasionally are little questions raised, little philosophical questions raised in the media about could this possibly be harmful to us? But these are very small in comparison to the very large weight in the media on the other side of the balance, the side of convenience of modern life and so on. So there is the question of distraction on the one hand. So we are distracted, for example, towards issues of war and the environmental anxieties. So we don't notice, don't pay enough attention to the technological developments. But on the other hand, at perhaps a deeper level, is the question of the lack of freedom in the cultural realm, particularly in education. So in schooling, when I was at school many years ago, I was lucky enough to be taught by my English teacher to systematically to analyze advertising, for example. So already as a young teenager, I was helped to become aware of what was being done to us, so to speak, through advertising. This teacher did not have any kind of Marxist agenda or something. He just approached it from the point of view of the use of language in propaganda and in advertising. And propaganda of all kinds, political and commercial, but in particularly advertising. So that really opened one's eyes as a young person to the kind of ways in which commercial advertising was used to guide us in certain ways. And I think that we, in general, in our education systems in the West, are not helped sufficiently to develop our thinking so that we can become truly independently thinking people. We are rather encouraged to become dependent on the largely self-appointed scientific, political, commercial elites who govern us. And this is another reason why people do accept what they are given in the media, and of course many people will notice that you can go to bars and cafes and so on and hear the talking points that go on, which are largely talking points framed by the mainstream media. So there's not enough critical engagement with the mainstream media because our education system does not educate us to be freely thinking and independent human beings. So we're not really equipped to cope with what is coming towards us in something like technological developments like 5G, for example. As far as the role of science is concerned, I think it's not an exaggeration to say that really the natural scientists are the cardinals, the Catholic cardinals of our time. So the role that the Curia, the Vatican and the cardinals played in the Middle Ages is now played by, for example, bodies like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change or any other scientific bodies, scientific authorities, which then give their nostrums, their dictums, their new doctrines and dogmas to the people, which are then spread from the modern pulpits, the Sunday sermons, which is the mainstream media today, which the people then suck up, and that then goes into their thoughts and then comes out of their mouths. So in that sense, this again goes back, do you see, to the what happened over 1,000 years ago when the church sought to remove the capacity of individual human beings to become individually striving spiritual human beings who could find their own way to God or to the divine or to the spirit, which is really the essence of spiritual freedom. You have to become dependent on the experts. And the experts today, when in our largely atheistic, increasingly secularist society have been removed, there is no more God, it is said, there is no more spiritual world, there is only this world, there is only this one life, and therefore our experts who we have to be dependent upon are the scientific elite. Again, in our education systems, it is not often taught how important for example, the early church councils were within the Christian world in Europe in controlling or guiding our ways of thinking. So most people in European societies today are not aware of the kind of decisions which were made in these church councils so long ago. Decisions, for example, to cut out anything which referred to a life before life or a life after death. The concept of reincarnation, which was by no means unfamiliar, for example, to the Celtic peoples or other pagan peoples before Christianity. And of course, most peoples across Asia before that time. And in that way, the concept of other lives was removed from European culture. And certainly by the year 1000 AD, this had disappeared. It had become a heresy to speak about that, or to go anywhere near that subject. So this, of course, creates a tremendous focus on this one life. And again, this has been part of the role of the Catholic Church, because the Catholic Church has very strong focus on physicality. If you think of the iconography, for example, of the Catholic Church, it's very much focused on this one life and this physical life, and the Catholic Church does very much value, in fact, this one physical life. You have only this one physical life, according to Catholic dogma, so you really have to behave properly in this one physical life in order to earn your place in heaven. Otherwise, you go to the other place. And so this was, as it were, the religious underpinnings, paradoxically, of materialism. And the Catholic Church has played a tremendous historical role in preparing for materialism. And this is a profound question, because it's easy for many people to think, therefore, what the Church did was completely wrong in seeking to destroy human freedom in this way. But we have to keep in mind that if that had not happened, if the Church had not actually done that, then you can ask yourself, would Western civilization have developed the science and technology that we have done? Because the Asian cultures did not. It's been the Western culture which developed this. And it was only able to develop this when, for example, first of all, the elites began to actually put religion aside. So already in the 15th, 16th century, certain significant sections of European elites were no longer really interested in religion. They were more interested in exploring the physical world. That process had been prepared, paradoxically, by the Catholic Church many centuries before. But in all those councils of the Church have been forgotten. So most Westerners don't understand how the basic way in which we philosophically look at history and the development of our culture was determined by these theological elites, who were, after all, the scientists of their time, in that they thought about how to understand what the world is. Those people were making the decisions many centuries ago. And as a result, we today, many of us, are still thinking in directions laid down by them. And we really ought to understand that, and our education systems don't help us to do so. I would say that 100 years ago, Rudolf Steiner attempted to correct this process of the reduction of the human being from a being of body, soul, and spirit to body and soul only, so a reduction of 3 to 2, from trinity to duality, if you will. He sought to correct that 100 years ago by speaking about and presenting new thoughts about the threefold nature of the human being, beginning even physiologically with the three physiological systems of the human being: the nerve sense system, the circulation system, and the metabolic limb system. And then he showed how these three physiological systems are related to our psychic systems, our soul systems, which is also threefold in terms of thinking, feeling, and willing. And this is something which is, again, profoundly related to the three steps which every one of us makes as human beings in the first 3 years of life, namely standing and walking, and then secondly speaking, and then thirdly thinking for oneself, which then results in the understanding that I am an I, which most people realize by about the age of 3, which is when they have begun to say I about themselves. So he brought these ideas forward, and on the basis of this threefold understanding of the human organism, that the human organism is body, soul, and spirit, then he sought to show how society itself needs to be structured in a similarly threefold way, rather than seeing social change and social development on the basis of some kind of animal model, which was done in the 19th century by social Darwinist thinkers, which leads to concepts, for example, of survival of the fittest and the struggle of groups, some social groups against other social groups, and domination and hierarchy, or else abstract concepts of social struggle based on notions of sociological abstractions, such as we find in Marxism, for example. So rather than these abstract concepts, abstract intellectual concepts produced by certain philosophers or sociologists, or on the other hand, ideas which are drawn essentially from the animal world, he sought to show that we have to develop our society in ways which are really based on the human being, him or herself, as we are. And that means that the three systems of human societies, namely the cultural sphere, the political legal sphere, and the economic sphere, which are related to the human organism and the human soul, that these three need to be separated out. Just as our physiological organism is separated out and autonomous, it is not all mixed up. You know, that each physiological part of ourselves has a specific function to perform. And yet, at the same time, our physiological system is also interrelated. In the same way, our social arrangements need to be the three areas or three spheres of our social arrangements need to be autonomous and separate, but also interrelated in such a way that, for example, the political sphere, the state, does not dominate and interfere with the cultural realm, research, religion, philosophy, science, medicine, or with the economic realm, production, distribution, and consumption. Similarly, that the economic realm should not, as it does in modern capitalist countries, dominate and push and control the political realm or the cultural realm, or as we see in a society like China, the state, in an almost religious way, seeks to dominate the cultural realm and the economic realm. So these three realms need to be separate. And it's because these realms are all mixed up and confused in our modern societies that we get many of the problems we have. So it's really important that we begin to see how these realms can be separated. And just to give one example, in the economic sphere, for example, one could imagine that one would have in a local community, such as a small town, a local economic association, whereby representatives of the spheres of production, manufacturing, distribution, and consumers' organizations within that local community would meet together on a regular basis and, as it were, oversee economic activity in that area. So if somebody wished to start a new factory in a local area to produce something, that would actually be, one would have to, as it were, put one's project, one's initiative to the local economic association and see whether that was truly in the interests of the local community. The point being here, the essential point being, that this association would not be run by people who were political bureaucrats, as is the case today, but it would be run by people who are actively members of, as it were, people fully engaged in the economic realm itself. So they really know what they're talking about. Today we have local chambers of commerce, for example, but they tend to be organizations which promote the self-interest of manufacturers only. It's not, the consumers were not traditionally involved in local chambers of commerce, and at their worst, local chambers of commerce often tended to become cartels to promote these self-interests of manufacturers. So if you had a local economic association, then this would work for the harmony and the economic benefit of the whole community by reflecting the interests of the three spheres of the economic community in a particular area. And this in itself then would liaise with the local political, for example, local government authorities in the area. If you had some international organizations like a multinational corporation which sought to muscle its way in, for example, into that local area, then any possible resistance against that would be mobilized by the local association working together with the state authorities. But ideally, of course, that would not happen, because for this new approach to economics to work, you, of course, would need to have a new education in working right from through the education system from the beginning, so that would show how we human beings are all dependent on each other. For example, in the context of the world economy, and we've been living in a world economy for at least 100 years, a global economy, then of course we are all dependent right from as soon as we get up and eat our breakfasts on people on the other side of the world. So we don't yet fully understand, particularly on a feeling level, how we truly are dependent on our fellows, on contemporaries, right across the planet. And that means that any economic system which is based on the notion of competition against our fellows is ultimately destructive in this global economy. And that's why the concept of what can be called the unitary nation state, where you have an economy and a state which are combined in such a way that the state uses state power to further the private interests of capitalists within a particular country, that leads inevitably to conflict and war, as we've seen so many times over the last 200 years, with other countries. Because these states see themselves as having competing economic interests in an economic warfare. So if we can go beyond that to an understanding that the economic realm in the world is truly global and that we all depend on each other, and that the cultural realm is also truly global because artists and scientists also depend on each other. But by contrast, the political legal realm is not global. The political legal realm has grown out of the particularities of the histories of individual communities of people. And that needs to be respected and nurtured. It cannot be globalized. And so, in that sense, the political and legal realm needs to be national and under national control, communal control, by contrast to the other two, the economic and the cultural realm, which are in themselves global. The starting point, as many people often point out, certainly is education. Because if the teachers are not allowed to be free in what they teach, then if they are under state control, then you cannot have a citizenry which is made up of free-thinking human beings. So we have to ensure that the curriculum, the curricula of school education, college, university education, all levels, is completely free of state control when it comes to what the teachers are actually teaching, what they decide to teach. They have to be able to decide what to teach in terms of the needs of their pupils as they perceive them. I think actually if people really took the time to think about it, they would see that political bureaucrats are not the best people to decide what should be taught in schools. And even though political bureaucrats may then delegate or may choose educational experts to report to them about ways in which the state could guide the education, so a sort of indirect state control, you might say. Nevertheless, those educational experts are often being, shall we say, encouraged to serve the direction in which the state wishes to move. So you have another agenda there, which is not truly cultural or educational, and therefore goes against the individual freedom of both teacher and ultimately of pupils. And this is very clear in my own country, where there's been a big change since the 1960s to the situation today where we have national curricula which are determined by the state. And the state now exercises a very large control through its inspection systems on what teachers are allowed or not allowed to do. And that also includes, of course, things like how much technology is introduced into the schools, for example, whether you have young children encouraged to get into coding, computer coding and the like, at a very young age, or whether Wi-Fi is used in nurseries or in kindergartens or in the very early ages of school and so on. All of this tends to be driven by the needs of the state with the needs of the economic warfare or the competition of one state against another in mind, with the idea of getting children to develop, for example, computer skills as early as possible, even though this may be is not good for the children to do too early, because you're introducing the young children to an overly rationalist, overly abstract system of thought, as well as exposing them to all of this extra radiation and contact with technology too early. So it has to begin with the freedom of the teachers to be able to teach what they see is necessary. We have to start by encouraging parents and citizens in general to really question these fundamental ideas that most people tend to accept, namely, does the state have a role in education, and if so, what is it? The state, I would say, does have a role in protecting the physical circumstances of children. So, for example, in things such as safeguarding or hygiene, requiring that educational institutions protect the physical circumstances of children so that all children can have an education in good, hygienic and safe conditions. That's perfectly fine. But when it comes to the content of the education, that's something completely different. And that has to be left to the educational experts. Political bureaucrats should have nothing to do with that. I think this is not a difficult idea for people to understand. Similarly, you could say the same about medicine. Do we want political bureaucrats and administrators to be interfering in the medical arrangements we have? I would say not. This has to be left to the health experts, the doctors, the nurses, and so on. So in this sense, people have to be encouraged, I would say, to challenge the question of state control of education. This is an absolutely important aspect of the changes we need to make in the 21st century. The state has to be removed from education. In the same way, on the other side of things, you could say that money, the economic motivations, have to be removed from politics. Where we see in a country like the United States, politics today is largely a nonsense, because without becoming a millionaire, you can hardly be involved in politics. So we have to ask ourselves, Where is the right space for the state to be itself? What should the state be doing and what should the state not be doing? These kind of questions should already be encouraged in, for example, civics lessons in schools, but they are not, at least not in my country, not in Britain. And it has to begin in this sense with education, an education towards freedom. I think my main concern is, apart from the long-term questions of the environment, which I've already mentioned, my main concern is preventing any conflict between the East and the West. And a very big difficulty here is that Europe is increasingly bound up with the United States, notwithstanding the fact that at the moment there are certain, shall we say, temporary difficulties because of the policies of the Trump government in America. Trump will be gone in a few years. But the underlying direction is for the military, diplomatic, political, and intelligence, that means intelligence agencies, connections between the United States and Europe to be ever more bound together in a posture of opposition and hostility towards the countries of the East, Russia and China, Iran, for example. And this is extremely dangerous. And of course, one thing which is facilitating this dangerous situation, in my view, is the EU. So the EU is seeking to become I would say, a unitary supernation state, a kind of empire, as some of the Eurocrats put it, such as Guy Verhofstadt in Belgium, on a par with, on the same level as Russia and China and America. So this is seeing the EU in terms of power and prestige, a great powerful empire, and a system which is, again, a unitary state, which is not a threefold organism. So this is essentially something based on ideas which are old and regressive, but which is pretending to be forward-looking and 21st century. We need a completely different way for the peoples of Europe to relate to each other, not in this attempt to, as I would see it, recreate a kind of Napoleonic or Roman empire on a certain Americanized model. So the existence of the EU, I think, is something that we need to overcome. And for this reason, I look upon the British attempt to get out of the EU as a positive sign, even though there are potential problems. Many people in Britain are afraid that Britain will come out of the frying pan into the fire, so to speak. That is, Britain will be drawn ever more closely to the United States. Well, it is up to the freedom of the British people to decide whether that is to happen or not. They have to decide that. I hope they will not do so. But once the countries of Europe can remove themselves and realize that from the EU and realize that the EU is not, in fact, the way forward, then comes a possibility that we can come together as Europeans in some new form of association, which I would hope sometime in the 21st century, probably sometime later on, towards the end of the 21st century perhaps, would be based on the threefold understanding of the human being, the threefold understanding of society, an international European threefold society of culture, politics, and economics, as I mentioned before. This is the paradox, you see, that we needed to kill our spirit in the West in order to develop materialism so that we could develop technology. We wouldn't have any of this if we hadn't done that. And that's the paradoxical role of the Catholic Church. It's easy for people to think, the Church is bad or Christianity is bad because it's done that, you see? But we simply wouldn't have had any of these things because despite the Chinese and their fireworks and their gunpowder and their printing, that's as far as they went. And all of those developments were based on observation of the natural world. What do the wasps do? Oh, print paper. Right, and things like this, yeah? But they didn't take that further because they didn't develop logic, mathematical logic, yeah? And it's only when you get into the development of mathematical logic, which the Greeks develop, and then you start to get the kind of scientific, technological changes that the West was able to do, yeah? You don't see that anywhere in Asia.
The Arabs.
Because they stayed with their spiritual perspective. But the Arabs, actually, first of all, the Arabs didn't do anything. The Arabs translated. They made a few little changes around the edges, so to speak, yeah? But basically they were transmitting what the Greeks had already done. Yeah? And perhaps in medicine, the Arabs made some really helpful contributions. But again, that has to do more with the observation of conditions of illness, and also the observation of the natural world in terms of medicines. But it's really the development of mathematical logic and the quantification of everything which enables science and technology to take off, I would say. And that the East was not interested in that, because they maintained their faithfulness, so to speak, to the spiritual world. Yeah? And also they maintained in various ways that the individual was still allowed, through meditation processes and so on, to find their own way to the spiritual world. So they weren't, as it were, distracted by a focus on this world. They weren't distracted from the search for the spiritual world. Obviously, I'm talking about those people who had the time and the energy to follow a spiritual path. Obviously, most peasants did not. Yeah? But this is the reason why the East did not develop these things, and the West had to develop these things. Somebody had to do it, and it was the task of the Western culture to do it. But now we've done it to such a point that if we go on doing it, we will kill not only ourselves, but the whole planet. Yeah? So we've now got to redress the balance in Western culture, not simply by saying, oh, well, we'll carry on with technology and we'll go back to the East and we'll sort of bring in Eastern spirituality and Eastern traditions, which is what many Westerners think and have been thinking since the hippie times. But rather we have to rediscover, I would say, these esoteric underground traditions which have always been there within Western culture, but which the outer mainstream churches suppressed for many centuries. Yeah. And if we do that, then we can, I think, begin to rebalance our very unbalanced society which we have at the moment.